Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are wading into some of the most complex and I think often painful, but absolutely essential aspects of the human social experience.
We really are. We're talking about the hidden costs of social stigma.
Exactly. And this isn't just a discussion about, prejudice in the abstract.
Well,
It's an intense examination of how societal power structures, they fundamentally impact individual psychology, our physical health, and even, performance on cognitive tasks.
that's a really crucial distinction to make right at the top. Our mission today is to move past the simple observation that, yes, discrimination exists.
Right, we all know that.
We all know that. Instead, we want to focus on the powerful psychological and sociological frameworks that explain how that discrimination actually operates, and then how individuals manage and resist and cope with all that pressure.
So what's our source material looking like for this?
We've synthesized a lot of material that covers some foundational definitions, like the specific dimensions that define what a stigma even is. And then we get into these critical models, things like the minority stress model and stereotype threat.
Okay, so the ultimate goal for you, our learner, is to walk away understanding the specific mechanisms at play when someone belongs to a stigmatized group. We really want to illuminate the often hidden burdens involved.
And give you the conceptual tools to analyze these dynamics on a much deeper level.
Yeah, we're not just reading you a definition, we're trying to break down the engine.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the absolute fundamentals of power.
Let's do it.
Stigma, it seems to me, is fundamentally tied to power. Our sources make this really, really clear distinction between privileged and stigmatized status.
They do. And when we talk about a privileged group, it's important to define that. We're not necessarily talking about wealth.
Right, not just money.
Not just money. Privilege status is primarily defined by that group's control, its power, and its influence within a society. Membership in that dominant group, it's just seen as the baseline. It's the default.
It's natural and normal.
Exactly. It's a status that, and this is crucial, is often taken for granted. You don't have to spend your cognitive energy constantly monitoring whether your group membership is going to cause you a problem at the grocery store or, in a job interview.
Whereas for stigmatized groups, that's their reality. They're the ones who differ from that norm, that default setting.
Right, whether it's in appearance or behavior or identity. And the key is that the characteristic they possess is devalued by that powerful dominant group. That's what sets them apart.
So the key here really is control. Control over the definition. The dominant group is the one determining who is stigmatized.
Absolutely. And that determination is completely fluid. It's entirely dependent on historical and cultural context.
Which means what's stigmatized in one era or one part of the world might actually be celebrated in another.
Precisely. The boundaries are, for all intents and purposes, arbitrary. But the consequences are very, very real.
And once a group is defined as stigmatized, our sources say its members become, what, the marked?
That's the term they use, the marked. And this leads to a really critical psychological consequence. Objectification.
Objectification. Let's unpack that. What does that mean in this context?
Our research highlights that they are treated as if they are objects, or maybe more accurately, as representatives of a category or a stereotype, rather than as unique, complex people.
So they lose their individuality in the eyes of the dominant group.
Completely. And that is a massive psychological burden to carry. You're no longer Sarah or John, you're that kind of person.
That concept, being treated as a category, that feels so central to everything we're going to talk about today.
It is. It's the foundation.
Now, to help us understand how this burden actually manifests, our sources break down the experience of stigma into 5 key dimensions.
Right. And what's fascinating here is that the experience of carrying a stigma, it varies dramatically based on where it falls across these 5 different dimensions.
So not all stigmas are experienced the same way.
Not at all. The first dimension is course, which really just deals with stability and time.
Okay, so is it permanent or not?
Basically, yeah. Some stigmas are stable and irreversible. Maybe they're related to certain physical characteristics or identities that just don't change. But other stigmas are unstable. They can change over time.
Like what? What would be an example?
Well, think about what the sources call benign stigmas. These are often temporary, maybe related to a temporary illness or an injury or even a short-term economic situation like being unemployed.
I see. And the mental health implications for someone dealing with an immutable, unchangeable stigma versus a temporary one must be vastly different.
Hugely different. One implies a lifetime of management, the other has a potential endpoint.
Okay, that makes sense. Then we have the second one, concealability. This seems like it has huge implications for daily life and internal health.
It's a big one. So some stigmas, like certain non-visible health conditions or sexuality, can be hidden. They can be controlled.
Which on the surface sounds like a good thing.
Oh, sounds like an advantage, right? But the sources point to this huge hidden cost to that control. Hiding the stigma actually seems to compound the problem in some ways.
How so? Why would hiding it make it worse?
Well, the cost of concealment is it's really complex and profoundly taxing on your cognitive resources. The source material is very clear. Concealing a stigma does not reduce the associated guilt and shame.
It doesn't get rid of it.
It doesn't. In fact, it often compounds the internal distress. Because the person is essentially maintaining a form of cognitive dissonance, their internal reality does not match their external presentation.
So they're living two lives, in a way.
In a way, yes. They are constantly monitoring their environment, they're censoring their speech, they're managing the flow of information, and they're living in this constant fear of accidental exposure. This act of continuous monitoring, it just takes up vast amounts of energy.
Energy that could be spent on, I don't know, life.
Exactly. Energy that could be spent on life tasks, but is instead spent just maintaining a facade.
So the energy that someone with an unconcealable stigma might use to, say, deflect or cope with overt prejudice from the outside. The person with a concealable stigma uses all that energy internally just to police themselves and maintain the secret.
That's a perfect way to put it. It's just a shift in where the battle is being fought. People with unconcealable stigmas, they have to directly cope with external prejudice and discrimination every single day.
They don't have the burden of secrecy,
But they face constant external threats, whereas the person with a concealed stigma, they face this constant internal erosion from the psychological demands of secrecy and that associated guilt.
Wow. Okay. The third dimension is aesthetic qualities. This one seems more straightforward.
It is, in a way. It focuses entirely on appearance and how visible physical cues can frequently trigger stereotypes.
So we're talking about things like facial asymmetry or disfigurement or...
Or weight, or even just the visible signs of old age. These physical traits can lead directly to stigmatization simply because they are visible, and they immediately cue these negative assumptions in people's minds.
And those assumptions can just override any other positive information about the person.
They often do. The visual cue is immediate and powerful. It happens before you even get a chance to demonstrate your character or abilities.
Okay, that's three. What's the fourth?
The fourth dimension is origin, or you could call it controllability. This one asks the question, how did the stigma arise? Was the onset under the control of the individual?
Ah, the blame question.
Exactly. This perception is absolutely critical for how other people respond to the stigma. If the dominant group perceives the stigma as uncontrollable, so, they believe the person couldn't help it, like a genetic condition.
Then the reaction is different.
Much different. They tend to feel more pity and less anger.
And the reverse is true, which I imagine is where we see some of the most intense social exclusion.
That's right. If the stigma is perceived as controllable, if the person is seen as having, say, chosen the behavior or identity, or is somehow responsible for their own condition, the reaction is often way less sympathetic. It can be highly punitive and even involve moral outrage.
So what kind of stigmas fall into that category?
Well, for example, stigmas that are related to a perceived lack of self-control, like addiction or certain lifestyle choices. Those tend to elicit anger and disgust, which are much, much stronger drivers of rejection than the pity that might be evoked by uncontrollable stigmas.
Okay. And that brings us to the fifth and final dimension.
Which is danger. This is the perception that members of some stigmatized groups pose a risk or that they're physically dangerous.
And this perception, I assume, is an incredibly powerful driver of stigma.
It's one of the most powerful. Groups that are assumed to be more dangerous are generally the most severely stigmatized. This fear, it just elevates the level of required social distance, exclusion, and even things like police scrutiny that are imposed by the dominant group.
So we've looked at the dimensions an individual carries, but stigma also acts like a social force field, affecting even those who just stand near it.
That's a great metaphor for it. And that concept of proximity, it really sets the stage for what our sources call secondary stigma, or stigma by association.
Which is also sometimes called courtesy stigma.
Right, courtesy stigma. It means that members of the dominant group who maintain close associations with members of a stigmatized group can actually suffer negative social consequences themselves.
So they get stigmatized just for the association.
That's it. They're essentially being punished for violating the unwritten social rules of separation.
To really understand how potent this is, we have to look at the empirical data. I'm thinking specifically of the Newberg et al. Study from 1994.
Oh, that study is a textbook example of courtesy stigma in action. It's so clean in its design.
Walk us through it. What do they do?
So, male participants watched a video of an interaction between two other males, let's call them A and B. A and B were introduced to the participants either as friends or as total strangers. Then, during the interaction, person A reveals some information that suggests he's gay, thereby introducing this stigmatized identity into the dynamic.
And the participants watching just had to rate how they felt about person B.
Exactly. They were asked to rate how comfortable they were with person B.
And what did they find? What were the results?
The key finding was that participants were significantly less comfortable with B, but only when B was A's friend.
Wow.
If B was just a stranger who happened to be interacting with A, the level of comfort didn't change at all.
So it was the friendship,
Yeah.
the voluntary association.
That's what the study demonstrates so powerfully. The association, that friendship tie, was sufficient to transfer the stigma, even though B himself was heterosexual. The dominant group members actively distanced themselves from the individual who dared to maintain that close, voluntary connection.
It's a powerful illustration of the social boundaries people create. And that idea of proximity, it kind of shifts us into another critical concept in the stigma landscape, tokenism.
Right, which is all about group representation, but in a very specific context.
Explain what token status is.
Token status occurs when one group vastly outnumbers another and only a few members of the other group are represented.
The classic example is always the single woman in a boardroom full of men.
That's the one everyone knows, yeah. But it can apply to any social category, race, age, ability, anytime you're contextually outnumbered. Being a token isn't necessarily about deep-seated prejudice in every single instance, but it's about the perceptual dynamics that shift when you are the severe minority in a room.
Okay, so what are those specific perceptual consequences for the person who has that token status?
Our sources detail three main perceptual tendencies that the dominant majority uses, often completely unconsciously.
Okay.
First, there's visibility. The token just captures everyone's awareness because they're unique, which means they're constantly being scrutinized. Every single action they take is amplified.
They're under a microscope.
Constantly. The second is contrast. The differences between the token and the dominant group, they get exaggerated. The token becomes defined entirely by their difference, and that pushes their shared professional traits or skills into the background.
And then the third one, which sounds particularly frustrating, is assimilation.
It is. Assimilation means that members of the dominant group will actually distort the token's characteristics to fit a pre-existing stereotype.
So they see what they expect to see.
Exactly. If the token is a woman and she's assertive, she might be seen as bossy, which fits a negative stereotype about women in power. It doesn't matter if a male colleague exhibiting the exact same assertiveness would just be labeled decisive.
And the consequence of all this is that the token's actions are often seen as representative of their entire group.
Yes. If the token makes a mistake, it's not just their mistake. It reflects on everyone who shares their identity.
That's an incredible amount of pressure.
It is. They often feel incredibly isolated, under intense pressure, and they frequently believe they have to just ignore all those differences and not let them affect their work.
And this creates what the sources call a chilly climate.
A chilly climate, exactly. Tokens just don't feel truly welcome or supported. They're navigating not just their job duties, but this immense emotional labor of representation, scrutiny, and the constant distortion of their own identity.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because there's a huge gendered exception to this tokenism phenomenon.
The glass escalator effect.
Exactly. It shows that tokenism isn't just about being outnumbered. It's about the inherent status of the groups involved.
That's the key takeaway. Our sources show that men in female-dominated professions, like, say, nursing or elementary school teaching, they rarely experience the negative aspects of tokenism that women face in male-dominated fields.
So they don't hit a glass ceiling or suffer from those contrast effects.
Quite the opposite. They may experience the glass escalator effect, finding themselves on the fast track to promotion.
Why does that happen? Why is the male difference treated as an advantage instead of a liability in that context?
Well, it connects right back to that idea of privilege status we talked about at the beginning. Society kind of inherently assigns higher status and leadership potential to men.
So when a man enters a female-dominated field,
His presence is often interpreted not as a curiosity or as something strange, but as a sign of unique ambition or potential, and that propels him upwards very quickly into administrative or leadership roles.
So the majority group in this case, the women, might actually see him as an ideal leader simply because he's male.
Yes, reinforcing the broader gender hierarchy, even in a field where women dominate in sheer numbers. It's the precise inverse of the negative token experience.
Okay, so we've defined the structural landscape of stigma. Now, we have to confront the physical and psychological toll. We're talking about chronic stress that's directly associated with disease. And this leads us right to a key conceptual framework, the minority stress model.
Or MSM, yeah. The minority stress model, it provides this foundational understanding of the unique stress load that's carried by stigmatized individuals.
How does it frame that?
It starts from the premise that chronic experiences of prejudice, or even just major individual incidents of prejudice, they produce chronic stress, and that chronic stress is fundamentally damaging to your physical health. It's strongly associated with disease.
So the model recognizes that minorities experience general stressors, like everyone else.
Right.
But they have this extra constant layer of stress that's unique to their identity.
Precisely. Everyone deals with general stressors, job loss, illness, death of a loved one. But minorities carry these additional stressors specifically related to their group membership. And this is where that toxic environment really begins, because these stressors are often relentless and just unavoidable.
Let's break down those additional stressors, starting with the external ones.
External stressors are the concrete, outward acts of prejudice they face in the world. These are objective events that a stigmatized group member may or may not immediately identify as an act of discrimination.
What's an example?
Well, they include subtle daily insults, what are often called microaggressions, but they also include overt bullying and, of course, physical violence.
Yeah.
The frequency and the unpredictability of these events mean the individual can never truly feel safe or relaxed in their environment.
And then you have the internal stressors, which are arguably more insidious because they're self-directed. They're constant.
They are. The two primary internal stressors are internalized prejudice and the expectation of rejection.
Okay, what's internalized prejudice?
That's when members of a stigmatized group conclude that society's negative stereotypes and prejudiced attitudes actually apply to them personally. It's incredibly damaging. It affects LGBTQ plus people, ethnic minorities, people with disabilities, so many groups. It means you're carrying the burden of societal disdain internally, which our sources highlight as just a powerful source of distress and self-hate.
And the second one, the expectation of rejection. That means they're always on guard.
Always. They operate in a constant state of hypervigilance, just anticipating that they will be treated negatively simply because of who they are.
How does that hypervigilance manifest in just, daily life?
It manifests as cognitive exhaustion. If you are constantly scanning an environment for threats, if you're reading every interaction for hidden bias and preparing a mental defense against rejection you think is coming, you are perpetually using your body's fight or flight system.
And that's not sustainable.
It's not. And the minority stress model, it really emphasizes that these internal and external stressors are interdependent. They feed off each other. An external microaggression validates the internal expectation of rejection, which fuels internalized shame, which in turn increases your vigilance.
And that creates that toxic environment you mentioned.
Exactly. An environment that actively damages both physical and mental health.
The model also includes something they call non-normative life events.
Yes. And these are life stages that the dominant group simply doesn't experience in the same way, but they're huge stressors for the stigmatized group.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think of the legal and emotional turmoil that's involved in immigration or seeking refugee status, or the process of coming out for LGBTQ plus individuals. It's not just one conversation. It's a repeated, high-stakes process of disclosure that can result in familial or social rejection every single time. These unique, non-normative milestones, they add significantly to the overall stress load.
When we talk about these chronic stressors, both external and internal, we really need to address them in terms of trauma. Our sources are very clear on this. Prejudice is often experienced not just as stress, but as actual trauma.
That's such a critical distinction. It moves beyond just general stress. Our source material confirms that just the knowledge of a discriminatory attack on someone who shares your identity, even if you were miles away, is sufficient to produce a trauma response.
That's vicarious trauma.
Vicarious trauma. Furthermore, Witnessing violence against a member of one's own group produces what they call a spillover effect. It actively damages the mental health of the entire community.
What's unique about the nature of this specific trauma? Because when we think of something like PTSD, we often think of a single acute event.
Right, and unlike a single acute incident, the trauma that's associated with chronic prejudice is often ongoing and repeated. It's not a memory of a past event that you're dealing with, it's a constant anticipated possibility.
Which means the nervous system can never stand down.
It remains stuck in a state of high alert. This increases chronic inflammation, which is directly linked to higher rates of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and other health issues that we observe in highly stressed minority populations. That constant anticipation prevents the nervous system from ever fully resetting.
Okay, let's shift gears now. I want to talk about one of the most widely researched consequences of stigma, especially in achievement settings: stereotype threat.
A huge area of research.
It is, and I want to focus really intently on the mechanism of performance reduction here, because it's so deeply cognitive. It's not purely emotional.
That's right. Stereotype threat, or ST, is the proposition that stigmatized group members are acutely aware that they are stereotyped regarding a specific ability, say, math skills or verbal competence.
And the risk of being judged, not as an individual, but in light of that negative stereotype, that's what creates the problem.
That's the threat. It creates this disruptive internal state. And this state fundamentally undermines performance, especially when the task is difficult and your cognitive resources are already strained.
The classic demonstration of this effect, it involved black and white undergraduates taking a difficult verbal GRE test. That study just so elegantly isolated the threat mechanism.
It really did. They engineered the situation perfectly. They split the participants into two conditions. Half were told the test was a highly valid diagnostic indicator of their intelligence.
So high stakes.
Very high stakes. This was the diagnostic condition, and it was designed to make the relevant racial stereotypes salient. The other half, they were told it was simply a research task or a non-diagnostic lab measure.
And the results?
The results clearly showed that when the stakes were tied to intelligence, the performance of the stereotyped group was significantly undermined. When the test was just a lab task, the effect essentially disappeared.
Which highlights the key features of stereotype threat. It's not about pre-existing competence or, self-esteem issues. It's about the immediate situational pressure.
Exactly. First, it's a general process. It can affect anyone if a negative stereotype about their performance in a specific task is brought to mind.
So you could stereotype white men about athletic ability or men about emotional intelligence, and you'd see the same effect.
You would. And second, and this is so crucial, it stems from the situational pressures that bring the stereotype to mind, not necessarily from the individual's internalization of that stereotype. You don't have to believe the stereotype is true to suffer from the threat.
Let's go deeper into that psychological mechanism. Our sources explicitly state that ST is not related to distraction or academic competence or self-esteem or even self-reported anxiety in a direct way.
Right.
So if it's not those things, what is actually happening in the brain that causes this performance strain?
When a person is under stereotype threat, they're experiencing two simultaneous resource-intensive processes. First, they are physiologically aroused. It's a genuine stress response, elevated heart rate, cortisol release, the whole thing. Second, and this is the critical part, this stress response and the act of managing the threat reduces the cognitive resources that are necessary for the task at hand. Specifically, it depletes your working memory and your attention-shifting capabilities.
So the mental energy that should be going toward solving the hard question.
Right, the energy you need to hold multiple pieces of information in your mind at once. It's being diverted. It's being used to monitor the environment, to suppress the worried thoughts about confirming the stereotype, and to try and regulate all that emotional stress.
The working memory buffer just collapses.
It collapses and performance suffers.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
The effort to not confirm the stereotype becomes the very distraction that ensures the stereotype is confirmed.
That's the cruel irony of it.
So since it's situational, we can design strategies to reduce it. What are the main strategic approaches our sources lay out?
There are three main categories. First, you have belief-based strategies. These focus on changing beliefs about the negative stereotype itself, maybe by demonstrating that it's invalid. Then there are identity-based strategies. These target a person's identification with the stigmatized identity, for instance, by decreasing the salience of that identity in that specific testing context.
And the third category, resilience-based strategies, that's more about internal psychological bolstering.
Yes. This approach aims to alleviate anxiety and improve confidence. This is where you see tactics like the affirmation of self-worth.
What does that entail?
Studies show that simply having someone write about their core values right before a high-stakes test can provide this psychological buffer. It restores a sense of self-integrity that is independent of how they perform on the test, and that seems to reduce the intensity of the threat.
You also mentioned some specific tactics in the outline, including one called the pride and prejudice approach. We should probably define that.
We should. That approach is a really powerful proactive strategy. It involves members of the stigmatized group simultaneously embracing their identity, that's the pride part, while actively rejecting the negative stereotypes, that's the prejudice part.
So it shifts the dynamic from internalized shame to external defiance.
Exactly. It changes the meaning of the identity relative to the domain of performance. It's about asserting agency over the definition, not just reacting to it.
Fascinating. Our sources also mention the power of role models, even when they're not physically present.
Absolutely. There's one compelling study that showed two groups of Black and white Americans who completed a verbal ability test. One group watched a speech by Barack Obama right before the test, and the other group did not.
And the group that watched the speech did better.
They performed significantly better on the test. This just demonstrates that merely activating the idea of a successful counter-stereotype can improve performance by subtly shifting the perceived context and the possibility of success. It mitigates the stereotype threat effect.
Okay, now for the counterpoint to stereotype threat, which actually provides an advantage to the dominant group, stereotype lift.
Right. Stereotype lift is defined as the performance boost that members of non-stereotype groups receive when information about group performance is present in the environment.
So it's not a benefit of their own high performance, it's a benefit of comparison.
Precisely. This boost happens because members of the non-stereotyped groups engage in what's called downward social comparison.
So they compare their expected performance favorably to the expected poor performance of this stereotyped group. That has to be a huge, unacknowledged advantage in competitive settings.
It's a massive systemic advantage. Knowing that another group is expected to perform poorly actually provides a performance lift for the non-stereotyped group because it reduces their own anxiety and boosts their confidence, the exact opposite of the threat mechanism.
And this has huge real-world implications.
Huge, particularly by providing a systemic advantage in high-stakes testing environments like the SAT and the PSAT. It contributes to the persistent performance gaps that we see in educational outcomes.
We've established the cognitive and health tool. Now we need to move to how people perceive and react to this constant, background radiation of prejudice. And here we encounter one of the most confounding psychological paradoxes in this entire field: the personal group discrimination discrepancy, the PGDD.
This is such a robust phenomenon. It's the finding that people believe their group, as a whole, is far more likely to be discriminated against than they are as individuals.
So they acknowledge discrimination exists out there in society.
Readily, but they minimize or deny their own personal exposure to it.
Why do people hold this discrepancy? It seems like a massive contradiction. Our sources suggest there are both cognitive processing limitations and motivational self-protection at play.
That's right. On the cognitive side, it's really about information processing. Group examples of discrimination, they're typically presented as these clear, unambiguous, statistical aggregate facts. That makes them easier to process and recall than your own messy, ambiguous personal interactions.
That makes sense.
Furthermore, people use different comparison standards. When you're judging your own experience, you compare yourself to other members of your own group.
Which normalizes the discrimination you've faced.
It does, but when you're judging your group's level of discrimination, you compare your group to other groups, which makes the discrimination seem much more pronounced and obvious.
Okay, that's the cognitive side. What about the motivational explanations? The reasons people want to deny or minimize their own personal experiences.
This gets into some deep psychological mechanisms of self-protection. There are several powerful motivational reasons. First, people want to preserve their psychological well-being. Acknowledging discrimination forces you into the uncomfortable identity of a victim, which can feel really disempowering and strips away your sense of agency.
And second,
Second, they may deny it to justify not taking action against unfair treatment. That reduces cognitive dissonance. But third, and this is critical, minimization is often driven by a calculation of the social costs.
And what are those social costs of claiming prejudice?
Claiming discrimination carries significant social costs from the perspective of the dominant group. You risk being seen as hypersensitive, as a whiner, or worse, as someone who is exploiting discrimination for personal gain.
Which is a powerful way to just dismiss the claim entirely.
It is, and awareness of these penalties directly affects the decision to report anything. Stigmatized group members often try to distance themselves from negative attributes associated with their group, and complaining about discrimination is often perceived as one of those negative, non-normative attributes they feel they have to avoid.
If the costs are so high, what are the conditions that would lead a person to override that motivational drive and actually confront prejudice?
Our sources use what they call the CPR model, the conflict process model, to describe the necessary steps for intervention. To confront prejudice, a person must first recognize the behavior as prejudice.
Step one.
Step one. Second, they have to perceive it as an emergency that requires an immediate response. Third, they must feel a sense of personal responsibility for intervening. Fourth, they have to decide on a course of action. And then finally, they have to see the benefits of confronting as clearly outweighing the substantial personal costs.
That is an incredibly complex series of rapid-fire decisions.
It is.
And people are more likely to successfully recognize and claim discrimination if certain situational conditions are met.
Yes. They are far more likely to claim discrimination if the behavior comes from an outgroup member, if they can attribute the negative treatment to an uncontrollable attribute, and crucially, if the prejudice is not masked by humor or flattery.
So if it's subtle or couched in a joke or it comes from someone in your own group.
It's much harder to categorize as a clear boundary violation and therefore much harder to confront.
Despite the psychological benefits of, asserting your own agency, studies show a generally low willingness to confront discrimination.
The numbers are stark. In one study that cited 75% of women were non-confrontational when facing sexism.
75%.
Yes. And this low willingness is directly tied to the accurate perception that confrontation often leads to lost opportunities. Furthermore, perpetrators react especially negatively to being confronted by an outgroup member. Their reaction is often to double down or retaliate, which just confirms the perceived risk.
But you pointed out a key error in this risk assessment, that people systematically underestimate the benefits of confronting.
They absolutely do. People tend to overestimate the costs of confrontation, the social blowback, and they underestimate the benefits.
Which are what?
Confrontation, when it's handled assertively, significantly increases feelings of closure, of self-esteem, and empowerment. It restores a sense of agency. And conversely, the cost of not confronting discrimination is profoundly underestimated, because the evidence suggests that if discrimination goes unchallenged, the perpetrator is highly likely to repeat the behavior.
So what are the individual psychological differences that make some people more likely to take that risk and report discrimination?
People who identify highly with their group are consistently more likely to report discrimination. And this tendency is often linked to being high in what's called stigma consciousness.
Which isn't paranoia.
It's not paranoia, it's a cognitive orientation. It's the firm belief that you live in a stereotyped world, which makes you inherently more sensitive and more likely to perceive and report possible discrimination. You view the event through a group identity lens rather than just as a personal slight.
Okay, so if confrontation is the chosen path, what are the most effective strategic responses? How does one maximize the benefit while minimizing the cost?
The strategy has to involve assertiveness without hostility. The individual should avoid aggressiveness and threat. The goal isn't to punish the perpetrator, but to change the behavior and assert self-respect.
So what does that look like in practice?
The recommended approach is to appeal to shared values. Fairness, egalitarianism,
Right.
positive self-images of the person being confronted. You frame the conversation around those shared democratic ideals rather than a direct inflammatory accusation.
Beyond confrontation or reporting, individuals develop these really sophisticated psychological defenses to manage chronic exposure to stigma, especially in domains where they face severe stereotype threat. Let's look at psychological disengagement.
Psychological disengagement is a defensive, and it's a highly strategic detachment. It's the psychological decoupling of your self-esteem from outcomes in a particular high-risk domain.
So you make your self-worth independent of successes or failures in that specific area.
Precisely. For instance, if a group faces strong academic stereotypes, a student might psychologically disengage their self-worth from their grades.
So if they do poorly on a test, their internal narrative is, That failure means nothing about me as a person because I don't really care about this domain anyway.
Exactly. It protects the self-concept from the damage of repeated failure or stereotype confirmation. The cost, however, is long-term.
What's the cost?
This often results in behavioral withdrawal, where the individual chooses to distance themselves from those areas where their group is expected to fail, and that, of course, limits their opportunity for success. It's a mechanism of psychological survival that costs them opportunity.
Then you have behavioral compensation, actively changing your behavior to disprove the stereotype,
Yeah.
which is almost the opposite of disengagement.
It's a very active, effortful response. When you're expecting discrimination, you proactively change your behavior to disconfirm the stereotype in the eyes of others.
So you have to work harder.
Members of stigmatized groups have to overcome these added burdens, meaning as levels of prejudice increase, higher levels of compensation are required just to achieve the same perceived status as a dominant group member. They have to work harder or be perceived as more perfect and error-free than their non-stigmatized counterparts.
That added burden, having to be twice as good, is just an enormous cognitive and emotional tax.
It is, and the ability to compensate, it isn't guaranteed. It depends heavily on the situation and the resources of the individual. The demands of the prejudice-related situation, they can't be so high that the person cannot physically or cognitively overcome them.
And there's a risk.
A huge risk of unintended consequences. You might misjudge the requirements of the situation and either overcompensate in an awkward way, or you might compensate in the wrong direction, which could inadvertently confirm a different negative stereotype.
Finally, let's look at strategies that challenge the stigma itself, rather than just coping with its effects. We're talking about reframing and self-labeling.
Right. Reframing is a powerful collective defense mechanism. It involves stigmatized group members challenging the stigma by changing the negative valence of a stereotype to a positive one.
How does that work?
They take the trait that was historically used to devalue them, often a symbol of their difference, and they collectively reposition it as an asset or a source of resilience or a mark of pride.
And the most concrete example of this psychological power is self-labeling, or reclamation.
The reclamation of derogatory terms is the classic example here. The shift in power over the language itself is crucial.
Like the word queer.
The reclamation of the label queer is probably the best-known example. It was originally a deeply derogatory term for gender and sexual minority groups, but it has been actively reclaimed by many into a positive self-label.
And in doing so, it strips the word of its original power to harm when it's used by outsiders.
It does, and it converts it into this potent source of community and shared identity within the group. It's a profound collective act of agency and power assertion.
This deep dive has really shown us that the experience of stigma is not just an emotional one. It's systemic, it's physiological, and it's profoundly strategic.
Absolutely. Every moment of a stigmatized person's life involves navigating these external threats and maintaining internal psychological defenses.
We started by defining the stigma landscape, noting those 5 dimensions: course, concealability, aesthetic qualities, origin, and danger.
And we explored the secondary effects like courtesy stigma and tokenism, including that structural advantage inherent in the glass escalator effect.
We then charted the hidden health toll through the minority stress model, identifying how the interdependence of external and internal stressors creates that toxic environment.
An environment that manifests as chronic, repeated trauma on the body and mind.
And we broke down the mechanism of stereotype threat, emphasizing that it's a direct drain on working memory and cognitive resources, not just self-esteem.
And we contrasted it with the unacknowledged advantage of stereotype lift.
Finally, we examine the complex processes of navigating discrimination, particularly that puzzle of the personal group discrimination discrepancy.
And the difficult cost-benefit analysis that goes into the decision to confront prejudice or to use those psychological defenses like disengagement or active compensation.
And our exploration really showed that the costs of inaction, the fact that discrimination is highly likely to recur, are often underestimated.
While the immediate acute social costs of confronting being viewed as a whiner are often overestimated, and that makes silence the path of least personal resistance in the moment.
So this leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, our learner, to consider as you go forward. We discuss the high cost of not confronting discrimination versus the documented personal and social cost of taking action. When assessing the situation, How does one strategically balance the personal risk of action versus the collective and future risk of inaction? And what role does stigma consciousness, that heightened awareness of living in a stereotyped world, play in tipping that scale toward confrontation or silence?
That's a calculation that happens every single day, and it's driven by all the deep psychological and social forces we've just unpacked.